www.rlpf.org. It's a new website and we're pretty excited about it, so I hope you check it out. Okay, so what is the Raquette Lake Preservation Foundation? I'll tell a quick little story. Two of our board members we're not to that slide yet, AJ. Sorry. That's okay. We're selling raffle tickets at last year's Labor Day picnic in the village, and they were approached by someone who said, "Are you a historical society?" We are not a historical society, nor are we a hysterical society, as I have heard. We are a 100% volunteer organization. And although our board members are also 100% volunteer, they are very active and very passionate about our shared goal, which is to protect, preserve, and promote beautiful Raquette Lake. And although we have our differences, we are very diverse in our opinions and have quite lively discussions. We collectively agree that the greatest threat to Raquette Lake's ecosystems and future water quality would be the introduction of new invasive species into our waters. Over the years, RLPF has been involved in many different projects and issues of concerns to its residents. The most long-standing project that we've been involved with is water quality monitoring. Every year we have volunteers that go out from May through June, and they take samples and they send them for analysis to the ALAP labs, that's the Adirondack Lakes Assessment Program. And then last year, primarily for the grant, well, maybe not primarily, we also joined the CSLAP program, which is the Citizens Statewide Lake Assessment Program. That required more samples in varied location, more volunteer hours. But another part in which why we went the extra mile was because their results are completely recognized by the DEC. As a matter of fact, the DEC was one of the founding principles of the whole organization. It was them and the New York State Federation of Lake Association. RLPF has worked with Paul Smith's Adirondack Water Institute now we have a volunteer stewardship agreement that provides our boat stewards that inspect all the watercraft before they come into Raquette Lake, only at the main dock, I should say. We know that there are many other launches, but that's primarily where the boats go in. And they're only there Memorial Day through Labor Day, but it's just wonderful to have someone there watching what comes into our waters and what they might try to take out to bring to other places. We've also participated in the New York State Loon Survey for several years, and for the past few years have been trying to look for alternatives to high-speed internet for boat access only and very remote properties on Raquette Lake. We've had some really good success, and we're still working on it. And for more information on that, you can also visit our website. In 2017, we got all the permits necessary from the DEC and the APA to start harvesting the one invasive species that we know of that's in Raquette Lake, and that's variable leaf milfoil. We started to harvest it in areas that had become so dense that it threatens navigation and recreation. Now, let me state that variable leaf milfoil has been documented in this lake for over 70 years. We will never be able to eradicate it. What we're trying to do is control it and mitigate it to the point that it will never threaten anyone's livelihood, navigation, or recreation. It's effective, but the problem is that it's very expensive. And the only reason that we've been able to take on that project is due to the really generous support from the town of Long Lake, and I have to thank them for that. They support us with grants annually out of their budget that takes care of most of the cost of our harvesting. We've also, particularly in the last few years, have received some very generous private donations from some of our members that have enabled us to do even more and explore more things. And seriously, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you. We understand, however, that we can't always depend on donations and toll the town of Long Lake forever, particularly in these times. So in the fall of 2019, our previous president, Ken Hawks, told the board about some New York State DEC grant opportunities, competitive grant opportunities, to help combat the spread of invasive species throughout New York State. In looking at all these opportunities, we very quickly discovered that to be eligible for most of them, you had to have a plan, a lake management plan to be specific. So if you were like me, you say, what does that mean? Does that mean we want to take over and manage the whole lake? Absolutely not. A lake management plan, to be specific, has nothing to do with anything but combating invasive species and monitoring water quality. A lake management plan will look at the data and surveys, past, present, and future. They'll look at public perceptions and opinions and give us a science-based roadmap on which to base decisions that we do make in the future. Once it's published, we'll also be eligible for so many more grant opportunities. Fortunately, one of the opportunities that was there was to help lakes like ours create a lake management plan. And after much thought and a lot of work, particularly from Ken Hawks and Lenny Shantz, we submitted a proposal and we were awarded a $25,500 grant to develop a lake management plan. Part of the funding had to come from matching funds. And once again, I have to thank the town of Long Lake because they gave us $2,000 just to put against the total immediately. RLPF further needs to match 25% of the total amount, almost all of which has already been met through in-kind and volunteer hours. And to all of our wonderful volunteers out there, thank you so much. In our proposal, and now as part of our grant, we need to complete 8 work plan objectives. Now you can go to the next slide. Okay, the first is to hire a certified lake manager to create the lake management plan, which of course we've already done. We sent out requests for proposals in the fall and we decided on Northeast Aquatic Research, or as we call them, NEAR. Near and dear to our hearts, I think. They are professionals. This is their full-time jobs, and they will collect data, analyze it, and give us their feedback in form of a lake management plan. Second and third, I'll really let them address because they've already done so much work in those 2 areas, is to assess our current lake conditions and identify water problems, if there are any. The fourth is to evaluate management alternatives. The alternatives are for continuing our battle against the spread of invasive species, and the alternatives will be evaluated for cost effectiveness and the sustainability for achieving the goals that we establish through this process. The fifth is to build local support. That's part of what we're trying to do through this meeting. We're trying to engage people to become aware of it and give us their feedback. We're trying, through advertising. We have a live survey on our website, www.rlpf.org, that will only be online till the end of this week. If you haven't already done so, I urge you to fill out this survey. We have, I think, about 120 already completed, which is great, but the more, the merrier. And if you act right now, no, only kidding. Okay, next is to develop a funding base to support the implementation of the management plan. And that, of course, is going to be developed through this process. Seventh is to educate all stakeholders about the lake management, again, through our newsletter, through our website, through meetings, through surveys. Seriously, we're trying to communicate in any way that we can. And finally, of course, is to create and publish the lake management plan. We started this process last fall, as I said, and we have until April 2022 to complete it. However, we're trying to have it completed by December 2021, and I believe that we're on target to do so. If we complete it by then we will be eligible for the next grant cycle, which will be in the spring of 2022. So with that, I would like to turn it over to NEAR. NEAR is a professional limnological research and lake management company. In case you don't know what limnological means, like I didn't, it means inland aquatic ecosystems. So that's what they do. They have over 30 years experience in studying lake systems. Their mission is to provide objective scientific evaluation of lake conditions for long-term understanding and management. Our 2-point people who I'm very happy to introduce, they've just been wonderful to work with, are Hillary Kenyon. She's a research scientist and certified lake manager, and AJ Reyes. He's an aquatic ecologist and certified lake manager. Thank you very much. Take it over, guys.
Well, Gail, thank you for the very nice introduction. Yes, so my name is AJ Reyes. I'm going to be taking the point here on talking to you guys about Raquette Lake and some of the work that we've started out doing in the past few months. As Gail said, I'm joined by Hillary Kenyon, who is my colleague at Northeast Aquatic Research. You did almost about a third of the slide, so that helps us kind of move along a little bit. I'll just kind of reiterate some of the stuff that Gail said. Yeah, we are a limnological research company, research and management company. Limnology, obviously, it's the study of inland water bodies, particularly lakes. It's a fancy way to say we like to be on boats all day, all day during the summertime. But no, so we, as Gail said, our mission is to provide objective scientific evaluation of lake condition for long-term understanding and management. And one of the things that sort of we believe, and we kind of keep it near and dear to our mission and what we really believe in when it comes to lake management is we are purely consultants. So we don't have any sort of monetary incentive to recommend a particular technique over another one and so on. And we believe that this is a core tenet of our company and the way we like to operate. We think that our recommendations and the plans we come up with and the monitoring we do is truly based on the best science available to help the lake achieve the desired uses that it would like to achieve. And we believe that this is a very important part of our company and the way we approach. And we hope that through this presentation, you'll sort of see the seeds of our philosophy, start talking about water quality and aquatic plants. The other thing too about our company is that we really like to have a personal hands-on approach. The people you see below here, and we're actually missing one person from this, is our entire company. We do have a small company, but we believe that this is a tremendous advantage in the fact that we can provide the lake users with a really hands-on approach. We've been in constant contact with Gail, Lenny, Kenyon, and the entire board on a constant basis. And we believe that this is really the only way to do lake management. It's not really instructive for a consultant to come in, not speak to anyone, and then give a report in 2 years on the lake. It really doesn't help anyone. The stakeholders don't really understand what we're doing. We also don't understand what's happening on the lake and what the uses are and how people feel. So the hands-on approach, we believe, is the best way. And public meetings like this really, really help get that sort of point across. So just to start off, we're going to start from sort of a 1,000-foot view of lake science sort of versus lake management. And this sort of, I think, will help set the tone for how we think, to kind of give you an understanding about how we think about lake management. All the problems that face lakes, and we're going to talk a little bit about those in the next slide, the only way to really fix them is to use science to gain an understanding of what's actually going on. So we like to use this stepwise process to be able to understand the problems and then how to fix them. So the first thing we like to do is we like to define what we can consider what normal conditions are. Now, that may be a little bit of a loaded term, but what we're trying to do here is we're trying to see what the lake looks like currently, also what it looked like in the past. What it looked like in the 80s and the 70s really can inform what's happening now, versus if there were large changes, either in the watershed or something in the water chemistry or aquatic plants. Within this investigation, then we move on to identifying some of the largest potential stressors or perturbations that are happening on the water body. And moving from there, then we like to implement, potentially recommend and implement fixes. And I want to pause here just a second just to kind of talk about this sort of break between the identifying what's going on and the implementation. It's really important to have some strong data behind your identification and then having a strong idea of what you're doing on the lake, because a lot of the times techniques that are used to fix a lake, either to control invasive plants or to increase water clarity or reduce erosion in certain areas, all these could have potential unintended consequences. And the frequency of these unintended consequences will increase and the severity of them will increase if you don't have strong data behind those particular actions. We've worked on plenty of lakes that have had herbicide treatments that have potentially harmed aquatic life. We've seen lakes that have tried to draw down the water level to try and control aquatic plants, to turn around and see those aquatic plants actually get much more abundant than before. So all these particular fixes really do require a good solid understanding of the lake's conditions, both past and current, to kind of give us an understanding how these particular techniques will affect things going into the future. So information is key. Information is the best currency we have in lake management and lake science. The last thing I'll say on this is, lake management is really about manipulating nature to suit human uses. Unfortunately, there are things that happen in these lakes that are going to potentially degrade the use of the lakes. Either clarity is going to get worse in some lakes, the incidence of algae, invasive plants. So the manipulation of humans basically going in and trying to keep the lake at a spot where it's usable for all people while also keeping the ecological integrity is just a part of the way lake management is. As long as humans and lakes are going to coexist, management is needed. So with that sort of over that kind of 1,000-foot view out of the way, let's talk about some of the threats that our lakes face, our lakes are facing today. There's a lot of different threats out here. I mean, I could have filled up 3 or 4 slides with the different particular threats that are happening. But some of the threats that we wanted to focus on, both in our water quality monitoring and also in the invasive plant stuff, and also in the lake management plan when it comes up, are the threats in terms of nutrient enrichment. So this is the increase of plant nutrients, plant and algae nutrients, particularly the increase of phosphorus and nitrogen into lakes. Both phosphorus and nitrogen are crucial for aquatic plant and for water and for algae growth. Phosphorus a little bit more important than nitrogen in freshwater systems. So controlling those, knowing how much of that is in the lake, and then controlling those numbers are important. Watershed overdevelopment. Luckily in the Adirondacks, that is something that has largely been muted. Other lakes, down where I am, down in Westchester, Putnam County, overdevelopment is a massive issue, and also in parts of Connecticut as well. And even close to you, lakes like south areas south of Lake George and Albany have been facing problems with overdevelopment. This is potentially adding nutrients and adding sediments into the lakes. That's one of the big threats of lakes. And I'm actually going to flip these next two. Invasive species. So the unintentional, or in some cases intentional, introduction of these invasive species, alien species into lakes that they were never there before, does pose a large threat to the functioning of lakes. I know in Raquette with the variable leaf milfoil, you've seen this kind of firsthand. But there's other great, I don't want to say great examples, but there's other poignant examples in the Adirondacks in terms of Upper Saranac Lake, Brant Lake, Lake George as well. So they can certainly have a tremendous impact both on the ecological and the economic value of a lake. And sort of what kind of bookends all of this is the increase is climate change, and sort of what impacts the climate is going to have on our lake ecosystems. For example, climate change can make conditions in lakes more favorable towards potential toxic algae, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Climate change can make it so that different plants are able to grow longer during the season, which could potentially lead to more invasive species taking over in the future. Climate change also has tremendous impacts on the physical functioning of lakes in terms of reduced ice cover and longer stratification during the season. And Hillary will talk a little bit about this in her section. So sort of climate change sort of bookends all these threats and potentially enhances them. So for this plan, we are going to primarily stick to invasive species, but we are going to touch on water quality. We are going to touch on some of the climate change, a little bit of the climate changes stuff as well. But yeah, so I just wanted to give you a nice brief overview of some of the threats that are facing all lakes, and they are going to be facing Raquette. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Hillary Kenyon, and she is going to discuss the water quality work that was done. So some of the review of some of the past data that you've collected through ALAP and Hamilton County and a few other sources there. So I'm going to turn it right over to Hillary.
Thank you, AJ. So I'm just going to start and say that this presentation is meant to be an introductory presentation, and ultimately we will have a second water quality and aquatic plant management presentation when we talk about the final components that are going to be in the lake management plan. So please consider this as an introduction to lake science and a quick overview of what we found in the water quality analysis so far. So I like to think of water quality as having four main parts. And of course, the parts sort of overlap with one another to some degree. But in generally, everything that you monitor to track change in lakes over time fits into one of these four categories. So visual, thermal, chemical, and biological. And to start, that visual assessment translates to how clear is the water. It's something that people can understand. It's something that you can see when you go swimming. You know if you're able to see the bottom in 20 feet of water or if you're unable to see the bottom in 5 feet of water. So what a Secchi disk transparency value does is it puts a number to something that we're able to see. And these Secchi values were collected primarily by volunteers and also by researchers from the Adirondack St. John's, right? No, St. Paul's, sorry. I get the colleges confused up there. But so a Secchi disc is a black and white, about 8 inches across disc that you lower over the side of the boat. And essentially you take a measurement by seeing how far into the water column the disc is still visible. You can see there's a picture of an aquascope here, where we recommend to our lake clients that volunteer monitors collect Secchi measurements with and without a view scope, because the view scope is supposed to shade out the light in your peripheral vision. It's supposed to reduce surface glare. But this was an invention that came after the fact that people started measuring water quality in the, I guess, all the way back to the 70s is when the main data set starts for Raquette. So to keep that similar and consistent into the future, we recommend with and without to get good comparisons over the years. And essentially what you're seeing here is 3 pictures. 17 meters of water clarity is something that you would only see in Crater Lake in Oregon. There's very, very few lakes that have that kind of clarity. And generally that's very low productivity. So there's nothing in the water column that's going to obscure clarity. There's no phytoplankton, there's very little sediment, and the lakes have very, very low nutrients. As you progress, where the lake becomes more nutrient rich over time, you have lessening of water clarity, so a lower Secchi disk transparency value. And by the time you get to about 2 meters of clarity, that tends to be when lakes are dominated by cyanobacteria, which is the harmful algae that you do not want to see in great numbers in your lake. Right now, water clarity at Raquette Lake is hovering around the 4 meters mark, which is fairly good, especially for a lake with high color, which I'll explain in a minute. The second is thermal measurements. So when I say thermal, I'm talking about temperature, but temperature really tells us a physical characteristic of a lake. And it's the temperature of a lake that drives all of the movement in the water column. So the summer and the spring and the fall are not the same at lakes. In the spring, a lake starts with a uniform temperature from the top to the bottom. And if you can look at the graph, I'm unable to point, but maybe AJ can do it for me. If you point to the top of the graph, that indicates the top of the water column. And where the 25 meter mark is about the bottom of Raquette Lake. And as you can see in May, the light pink column here, so the first one, yep, from the surface to the bottom is generally about the same temperature. It's a little bit colder. So the bottom x-axis, the horizontal axis is temperature in degrees Celsius. And as the summer progresses, you get into June, July, and August, you start to have an uneven heating of the surface water. So what that does is it increases the temperature in the surface, at a rate that's much faster than it would in the bottom waters. And in between the top and the bottom, you get this rapid temperature change with depth. And what that's called is the thermocline, which if you've ever been out in open water and you swam down to 20 feet, you would feel that rapid temperature change in the summer months. And with that temperature change, you have a difference in density gradients. So that means that the surface water is now less dense because it's warmer than the bottom waters, which causes the surface waters to essentially float on top of those colder, darker, denser waters in what we call the hypolimnion. So a lake during the summer is traditionally separated into three components, where you have the surface waters that are constantly mixing with themselves throughout the summer and are in constant contact with the atmosphere via wind mixing. And then you have the thermocline, or that rapid temperature change with depth, which essentially acts as a density barrier and cuts off that bottom hypolimnion area from the surface waters for the duration of the summer season. And in large lakes like Raquette, that's not normally a problem because you have a huge volume of water. But as lakes age and they become more nutrient rich, you do start to see a decrease in oxygen as the bottom sediments that have collected in deep water use it through respiration. So the sediments along the bottom of the deep water consume oxygen, which is normally not a problem because in spring and fall you have conditions that are fully mixing because the temperature gradient has eroded. But the problem is during summer, you're isolated, which means that oxygen consumption is a potential problem or a potential threat for Raquette Lake in the future as you move forwards in accumulating nutrients over time. And I say over time, which smaller lakes can change and go from being relatively clear water with good oxygen conditions in a very short period of time with good or high levels of disturbance. But Raquette Lake has a huge watershed, a very natural watershed for the most part. And so that change is very, very slow. And this is just a picture of the temperature and dissolved oxygen monitoring device that we use. So the measurements that are collected, and in this case collected by volunteers throughout the years, are measured from the top to the bottom in 1 meter increments. And AJ, you can go to the next slide. The second two components of water quality monitoring are the chemical and the biological parameters. So when I say chemical, I'm thinking of what elements are present in the water, what form are those elements in, how are they interacting with one another, and how much of them is in the water column or in the shoreline areas. And for the most part, everything that we did for the water quality analysis so far is from data that's collected in the northern basin of Raquette in the deep hole. And that is where the historical data has been collected. There's less data in some of the other bays from particular years through history, but as we make recommendations in the lake management plan, you might increase or see more information from other areas. So to go back and explain dissolved oxygen, what you have here again is on the horizontal axis is the season of 2019 from April to October. And on the vertical axis, you have the top of the lake at 0 meters or just below the lake at 2 meters, and then the bottom at around 24 to 26 meters. And throughout the summer season, you have a decrease. So you're shifting here from blue to green to yellow to orange to red. And by the time you get into the red, anywhere less than 3 milligrams per liter of oxygen is not good. We don't want to see that. And again, in the fall, the lake is supposed to go through a period of temperature uniformity, once again, where that oxygen would be replenished. But there's a problem with climate change where it's increasing the growing season. So it's potentially increasing the amount of dissolved oxygen that's consumed. And it's also increasing the amount of time that the lake is isolated from the top to the bottom. So that is one thing that we're considering moving forward. Moving on to nutrients, AJ has already talked about the concept of nitrogen and phosphorus, but just like humans need nutrients in micro amounts or in macro amounts, so do plants and algae. And plants and algae are the dominant forms that obscure water clarity, and the term is eutrophic here. So as you accumulate these nutrients, your lake will go through a series of changes and increase in what we call trophic status. So it will go from clear water to less clear water, primarily related to nitrogen and phosphorus. Phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in most cases, which means that it is the one in the least amount and the least supply. So if you increase the levels of phosphorus in the water column, even just a tiny bit, the plants and the algae are able to grow at much faster rates and much higher abundance. Excuse me. So phosphorus in clear water lakes like Raquette with very good overall water quality should be below 10 parts per billion of total phosphorus, or TP. I say total because phosphorus comes in many forms, and the standards as written for national water quality and regional water quality are total measurements. As you increase just slightly, so even just doubling the concentration of nutrients can push you into the moderate to concerning levels of algae growth. And by the time you get up into 30 parts per billion of phosphorus, which really is a very, very small amount, you will have higher amounts of algae and potentially worsened water quality. And I know that in the Adirondacks, people are used to seeing very, very good water quality. They're used to seeing low nutrient concentrations. But the southern part of New York is experiencing a really rapid decline in water quality, which is primarily a result of increasing phosphorus from overdevelopment, like the threats in the watershed, stormwater runoff, on-site wastewater. Basically, any impact that humans have in the watershed increases phosphorus because it's in something that we eat and it's all around us in soils. Even rainwater to some extent, tying into the climate change aspect of things. So increasing rainwater can also to some extent increase phosphorus mobility to the lake. And then finally, you get into the biological parameters. Oh, actually, I'm gonna backtrack for a second. So I have a whole list here of other nutrient chemical parameters that are also going to be talked about in the lake management plan. And just to give you a quick overview, everything will be defined in the plan. So if this is confusing to people, there will be handouts that will help people understand in the future what we're talking about. But so natural organic matter is measured by color. So instead of us visually seeing a difference in color, so is the lake more brown? Is it orangey? Is it kind of red? You use a machine to measure that change. And it's a measure of the amount of organic matter in the water column. Conductance is more of a measure of the dissolved ions in the water column, and it is attributed to increasing pollution, mostly related to chlorides, which is an anion and is included in the conductance measurement. And that has to do with road salts, wastewater, and unfortunately, it's increasing in many lakes across the country. pH and alkalinity are also tied, so people should be familiar with pH. It's generally that scale of 0 to 14 from acidic to alkaline or basic. And then water in the center tends to hover around 7. And for years, the Adirondacks was experiencing an acid rain problem. And only recently have we started to see the lakes recovering and pH measurements starting to get back to normal, or alkalinity measurements starting to get back to normal. And alkalinity is simply just the lake's ability to buffer pH change. And again, other things have been measured in the past, and it all ties back into water quality. So moving on to biological parameters here. Phytoplankton, zooplankton, bacteria, fisheries, aquatic plants, every single one of these biological parameters has their own interconnected science, but for the purposes of the lake management plan, especially the water quality section, what you're going to be seeing is phytoplankton. So the algae taxonomy from the limited number of samples that Raquette Lake volunteers have collected, and I think Len has actually identified all of that for us ahead of time, and chlorophyll A, which is collected in open water, and it is an algae pigment, which is then translated into how much algae, or a quantitative value of how much algae is in the water column. And aquatic plants is listed here despite it frequently being approached in a separate way. But aquatic plants tie back into water quality in almost every shape and form. And oftentimes you see changes in aquatic plants or shoreline algae way before you see changes in open water. And that is something that we are going to be discussing in the lake management plan moving forward. AJ, next slide. Thank you. So what have we done so far? The winter was primarily an exercise in getting all of the information together from all of the various sources that have collected water quality data throughout the years. The earliest record of water clarity was from apparently 1934. And then after that, there was not another water clarity measurement until the 70s. But since the 70s, there's been a pretty consistent record of certain types of water quality parameters, due in part to some researchers, but mostly volunteers, which is awesome. A lot of lakes, even in 2020, don't even have records. So the fact that Raquette Lake has a historical record is really impressive, and you guys should be very proud because it gives us information to make these decisions moving forward on how to best protect the amazing natural resource that Raquette is. And so this process here is basically a hierarchy of getting everything together, looking to see if the various sources are accurate, exploring the different methods in historical data collection to make sure that if something collected in the 1970s can also be compared to something collected in 2018. And then you have to clean it, which means organizing it into various formats so that it's standardized, so you can then decipher what's a high reading that maybe doesn't make sense. You can flag errors, potentially things that have shown up over time in spreadsheets over the years. And then it's an exercise of putting all the information on paper, visualizing it in all sorts of ways, looking for connections, looking for trends, and then making use of that information to communicate that to the stakeholders like yourselves. And in general, everything looks good. So you guys, the water quality data shows that there is a potential decreasing trend in clarity over time, but AJ, can you go back just a sec? Thank you. But there is a slight increase or decreasing trend in clarity, which normally would be really concerning. But if you tie that into other data sets that are in existence, you can see that it might simply be related to natural causes and increasing weather due to climate change. So despite climate change being a threat, it's not necessarily something that you guys can manage on your own. So the lake management plan will address it, but for the most part, your plan is going to talk about the things that you are able to do and the steps that residents and the local organizations can take to continue to have fabulous water quality. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I just want to say Raquette Lake is beautiful. You guys are very lucky, and it's overall has excellent water quality. A pretty close to pristine watershed. There are some areas in the watershed that are more developed than others. And in those areas, while we were doing our survey, we did indicate that there was more algae in certain areas, potentially related to localized nutrient pollution, and those will all be included in the plan. Deep water oxygen loss at the bottom of Raquette is very, very small. When I first approached this project, I have never seen a lake that's 100 feet deep that's only had 4 meters of clarity and somehow still managed to have oxygen. So you're very, I would say, considered oligotrophic despite having potentially declining clarity due to climate change. So overall, very good. And then I just want to remind people to be mindful of the impact if you live in the watershed. There are different rules to living on lakes and taking care of your property on the shoreline. Because you're closer to the water, the impact is greater. And large lakes change very slowly, and humans are sort of susceptible to wishful thinking, or a concept that I like to refer to as creeping normalcy, which is, if you haven't read Jared Diamond's book, I really recommend it. But it basically means that we're not looking for change unless you have a way to measure it over time. And that's where the data comes in, and how important it is to keep a consistent monitoring database over the years, because if you didn't have that, you'd be shooting in the dark. Like AJ said, you wouldn't know what your normal conditions are. You wouldn't be able to detect any changes and make changes to the management to prevent a potential catastrophic event, like complete decline in the bottom waters of oxygen, which is very, very common, unfortunately. There's a lake that is similar to size in Connecticut to Raquette, and also around 85 feet deep in its deepest basin. And it has no oxygen in the entire bottom water for the entire season. And so that's the difference between a overly developed lake and something that has high nutrients versus Raquette. And so you guys want to make sure that you stay there. And thank you for listening.
So thank you, Hillary, for that for the overview on water quality. Before we jump into aquatic plants, I was just going to touch on the idea of cyanobacteria. I wanted to circle back to this because you know, this is something that the Adirondacks in general really hasn't seen a tremendous amount of. However, it is projected to be a bigger problem in the future, and we know that last fall there was a very, very small amount of cyanobacteria that showed up on Raquette. So I just wanted to give a quick little overview of what this is. Some of it's going to be a little review from what Hillary talked about. Cyanobacteria, also known as bloom green algae, harmful algae blooms. They're not actually algae. It's one of the little misnomers about them. They are bacteria, but they have a lot of similar functions to the regular phytoplankton that we see in the water column. And some of the issues with these, actually, well, the thing about cyanobacteria that's kind of interesting is that they've been around for about 3.5 billion years. They predate us, definitely. They predate a lot of the animals that are on this planet, and they're responsible for a lot of the oxygen dynamics that are on this planet right now. They're really interesting creatures because they can live in these various extreme environments. They find them in sulfur vents, they find them in volcanoes, they find them in the bottom of the ocean. So they are really, really interesting. And normally they would be, you know, a nice, cool thing you would see on the Discovery Channel. You know, something you'd watch and say, oh, that's kind of a cool feature of the planet. However, in lakes, we sort of have a different tenor with them, and especially when they become overabundant, you know, because of the increase of phosphorus and nitrogen in these lakes, and they form these what we consider blooms. And this is when they get overly abundant, and they have a bunch of ecological strategies to become buoyant in the water column and form these dense green scums. And some of the issues with these scums include they can produce toxins. It doesn't happen all the time when these scums produce when these algae produce toxins, but they certainly can. Taste and odor issues for reservoirs, so they can have a really, really nasty smell. Unfortunately, there has been some in the past few years, some mortalities of pets because of overexposure to these particular toxins. You know, dogs especially, because when a dog goes into the water, they're constantly grooming themselves, and there's more areas for them to intake. So unfortunately, there has been some of those casualties throughout, you know, in the past few years. They also have other impacts in terms of depleting dissolved oxygen. They're just unsightly. Also decreased recreational use, boating, swimming, water skiing, fishing. You know, a lot of health departments will close down beaches if cyanobacteria scum show up in order to protect the health. And if the beach is closed down, that means people can't use it. And if a lake has a chronic cyanobacteria issue, you start to get this decreased property values. Nobody really wants to live next to a pea soup green lake. You know, and then that has cascading negative economic impacts. And to be clear, you know, we have no indication that this is going to be something that happens at Raquette in the very near future, but it is something to be mindful of. Particularly, you know, the picture in the top right or in the top left-hand corner was just taken a week ago at one of our other lakes in Connecticut. So it's not a far off problem in terms of geography. And you know, protecting the lake and doing this lake management plan and getting on top of the water quality really can help Raquette avoid this this potential state. You know, so I don't want to, you know, be too alarmist about this. I just want to let people know that this is one of the big threats that we face in lake management. So jumping into aquatic invasive species, These are now, for our discussion, we're going to keep it towards aquatic invasive plants. In the lake management plan, we are going to talk about stuff like zebra mussels and spiny water flea and a few other species that are in very close proximity to the Adirondacks and could potentially have some issues. But for our talk, we're going to talk about the invasive aquatic plants. And generally, a lot of aquatic invasive plants share sort of the same characteristics that make them a problem in these lakes. In particular, they grow very quickly. They have excellent growth rates, aggressive reproduction, and also multiple modes of reproduction. Variable leaf milfoil, as I'll talk about in a second, can reproduce via seed. It can spread via stolon, and it can also fragment. So if the plant stem breaks off for either a natural or an unnatural reason, that particular stem can grow roots itself and float off and land on a sediment that it likes, says, I want to make this my home, and then grow in this other spot. And that is actually one of the dominant ways that this particular plant and other milfoil species kind of get around. And that kind of leads into the third point of spreading rapidly, growing all over a wide range of conditions. These are temperature conditions, pH, sediment, color, light availability. A lot of invasive species can grow in poor light, which gives them an advantage over some native species. And some of the impacts is, if they get really, really abundant, they will replace dominant native species, maybe all natives. And that is certainly something we've seen in a lot of different lakes. And, on Raquette, there are some areas where variable leaf milfoil has taken over completely. So some of the challenges to managing them is that they have no natural predators, which normally keeps some native plants in check, but for some of these invasives, that's just not the case. They also can significantly degrade water quality, especially if you have these really, really dense patches, which sort of change the hydrology of the local area. So, Hillary was talking about the water movement in lakes, and when you have dense stands of aquatic plants, the whole dynamic of water moving in those areas decrease. And we've seen situations where in a dense bed of aquatic plants, at the very surface, the oxygen is pretty good, but the minute you go a little bit farther down, the oxygen tanks to 1 or 0 milligrams per liter. So you have some really severe local impacts that can affect macroinvertebrates fish within these really, really dense monocultures of invasives. Economically devastating. There was a paper that came out of Washington a few years ago that said that Eurasian water milfoil, a cousin of the variable, reduced property values by 16% on average. That's a good chunk of change to be reduced just because of a plant in your lake. But it's true. I mean, if you have a dense stand, it's going to be hard to, the property is not going to be as usable. And also, it is very difficult to control. And, regulatory challenges and, in parts of the country and, and the Adirondacks certainly make these plants a little bit more difficult to control. But yeah, if getting on top of these plants is certainly what a good lake management strategy is before they sort of get to be too abundant. And we will talk about more of these strategies in terms of prevention and early detection more into the plan. So just to quickly touch on variable leaf milfoil, as it is sort of the unwelcomed belle of the ball, if you will. It's one of these invasives that's actually native to most of the United States. A lot of invasives actually come from overseas or in South America. They enter the states through the aquarium trade or through ballast. Variable leaf milfoil, while probably introduced via the aquarium trade in 1932 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, there are parts of it where it's native in the U.S. But that does not mean it's any less dangerous to the lakes in the Northeast, which it has definitely shown to be. So some of the distinctive features is that when you look at it in the water, it really has these distinct overlapping cones of growth, and there's not many other species that grow particularly like this. There is one species of bladderwort that has a similar growth form, but it's once you see it once or twice, it really becomes pretty distinctive. And it also has, when it starts to flower, it has these different leaves. One of the reasons it's called variable, it has these different leaves on the surface, if you notice, that are sort of more full and not sort of leaflet-like. That sort of juts out from the surface, and that's the flowering spike. And then once again, just to reiterate the point, it can reproduce via fragmentation along with seeds and stolons, so really giving it an advantage over native species. So how do we get on top of this? You know, the start for any aquatic plant management strategy is to see what's out there. So we decided to go out and do a 2020 aquatic plant survey. It was part of our one of the tasks we were set out to complete, and the goal was to assess the current distribution and abundance of aquatic plants with specific attention paid to variable leaf milfoil. That's the invasive. That's the one your group is spending money on trying to manage at the moment. So that's the one we sort of have to pay the most attention to. And we were lucky enough to pull on some past data from, and especially, specifically from the Aquatic Plant Invasive, Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, which provided some baseline areas for where to search. So what we ended up doing is we did a almost full lake survey. We were lucky enough with some donations from your group to be able to extend our survey for about a day and a half, 2 days, which allowed us to cover a lot more of the lake than we thought we were going to get to in the initial time. So what we did is we visited all of these areas that are in red, which are all the areas with confirmed variable leaf milfoil, and also all the areas in green that did not have any confirmed milfoil at the time in 2016, but had some native plants. So we thought it was important to visit those areas as well. We did do some increased searching of selected infested areas, and I'll talk about some of that and some examples in a second. And at each waypoint, we looked at a few different things. We looked at the depth, the water depth, the species present, and Raquette has a lot of species of plants, which is a very good sign. There were times where Hillary and I were finding 8 or 9 different species at one particular point, which is a great sign for us. Not a particularly good sign for my hand trying to write all those species down, but it was it's certainly a good sign for the lake. So we looked at the species present. We also looked at the percent cover in these areas, and these methods we will expand on in the lake management plan. But basically, when we're looking at percent cover, we're looking at 3 different parameters. We're looking at 3 different methods, let's say, to assess percent cover. We're looking at the visual, so we're looking down at the water and we're seeing what is growing, and the good clarity at Raquette Lake really makes that possible. We're also putting rakes in, so we're using rakes that have either rakes that are attached to a rope that you sort of throw in and drag and pull up and you see what's there. Also rakes that are on a pole. That helps us get species that, let's say, we can't see, or if there's a species in the water that maybe the water's a little choppy and we don't exactly know what it is, we can use the rake to pull it up, confirm that what that species is. And we're also using a depth sounder, so a regular fish finder that you would find. And one of the cool things about the depth sounder is that you can actually see the height of the plants on the depth sounder, which really gets us some great information, especially in the deep water. So for example, if we're trying to define how deep these plants go, at a certain point, you can't see all the way down to the bottom, especially for low growing plants. So if you use the depth sounder, you can find out, wow, you know, this plant was growing in 13 feet of water. Or the other way it's sort of used is if we're going around in a shallow section and you know we start going in 14 feet, 14 feet, 14 feet, and we see this hump that goes up to 10 and 11 feet. And there's plants on there, we can go and check that out. And I've seen on other lakes in the Adirondacks, where finding these sort of humps of shallow water, where that's actually a spot where milfoils can hang out in. So using the depth sounder really helps us. So the combination of those 3 techniques helps us get a more holistic view of the aquatic plants at that point versus relying on one or the other. And specifically for variable leaf milfoil, we looked at something called growth form. And this is something, the reason why we looked at growth form is going to tell us how high the variable leaf milfoil is in the water column. Because for recreational impacts, it's a different ballgame if the variable leaf milfoil is only about 6 inches off the bottom versus does it contain the entire water column, right? If it's 6 inches off the bottom, you may not notice it. Boats can pass through pretty easily. It's possible that the natives are not being as impacted, but if you had topped out variable leaf milfoil all the way to the surface, that's a completely different thing, and a completely different way that affects your use of the lake. So just to jump into some examples here, we're just going to point out a few different areas that we surveyed. Because we just finished the survey, we don't have we don't have good species specific information just yet, but we're just going to kind of take a tour through a few different areas, and we'll talk about some of the things we saw. So the first area I wanted to talk about was Eldon Lake. The polygons you see, the blue shaded area and the yellow shaded area, correspond to where in 2016 APIP found native plants, and they found a bed of variable leaf milfoil. So our initial goal was to make sure that we covered every single one of these areas. But because we were able to get such a generous donation from your group, we were able to expand on this. So you can see all the areas that we searched that did not have polygons on it. And this was only because we were able to get that increased support from your group. And the important thing to note about this as well is that we're actually looking every place between these points. This isn't a situation where we take a point here and then we put our heads down and go right to this point and do another search. What's happening is that I'm driving the boat and Hillary is looking over either side of the boat. I'm looking at the depth sounder as we slowly go between points to make sure we're not missing any variable leaf milfoil points. And what you're seeing here, and why this is sort of a weird cluster of points right here, is this is all the spots that we've actually spotted variable leaf milfoil in the back of Eldon Lake. So once again, going back to the whole the percent cover and the way we're using visual assessments, the reason why they're all clustered is because what would happen is I drive by an area, Hillary would say, oh, variables here. We mark it down on the GPS, go to the next little area, maybe it's only 20 feet away. Oh, mark variable here, and then go on and so forth. So we think this strategy really, really is effective finding all the variable in the area. And this is important, especially for techniques like suction harvesting, which really rely on detailed GPS information on where the invasive plants are. So just wanted to show you here, this is an example of how sort of our surveys work and how we went about this. And this is also a good example about why, this is a good sort of test case for why it's important to keep surveying the lake. You know, in 2016, APIP did not find any variable in this location. So it's possible that this is a new expansion. It's possible that the variable was at low density at this time before, but then has increased. We're not exactly sure, and looking into the historical data, maybe we can get some, maybe we can expand on some of that a little bit. But the point is that this is why you do multiple surveys, because you find different things. So going to the Marion River, and I know this is something that that the Raquette Lake Preservation Foundation knows very, very well. So I'm not going to really be saying a lot of drastically new information in here. But this is an example of an area, and similarly to maybe not the same degree to South Inlet. This is an area where variable leaf milfoil has pretty much completely taken over. There's only a few pockets where there's native plants, specifically between the dots. But as you can see, just in this very small section of the Marion, the variable leaf milfoil is pretty much everywhere. When we saw it, it was almost always a growth of 4 or 5, so right up to the surface. And this will be this will be a challenge to control. And in the plan, we're going to discuss particularly how to deal with the Marion. What we think what areas should be prioritized, what shouldn't be prioritized, what techniques we think would work in here better than, let's say, work in the middle of the lake, and so on. So the last area I just wanted to touch on really quick was Suckerbrook Bay. And moreover, I wanted to touch on a feature of our surveys, which I think is very instructive. The area where plants can grow in lakes changes rapidly, depending on the slope. So some lakes have shorelines which drop all the way down to the bottom very, very quickly. It's a very, very steep slope. So not a lot of plants are going to grow there. Other areas, and Suckerbrook Bay is one of these areas, Boulder Bay is another area like this, where you have this really gradual slope, or pretty gradual slope, and you have more, more room for plants to grow. Oftentimes in these more gradual sloped areas, you have some sands, and you have some muck is able to accumulate there a little bit more than in some other places, and it can be more conducive to aquatic plant growth. So in our surveys, we really wanted to go and try and capture the entire littoral zone. So these inside points where this green polygon, which is once again is from APIP's work, these inside purple points that are here is actually what we covered, I believe, on our second day of work. However, because we had the additional time, we were able to come back and cover this outer section as well, and really helped us understand what was going on in the deeper waters. Variable leaf milfoil can grow in deeper waters, so it was important for us to go and sort of revisit this. And we've done this in a lot of different areas as well. Gone to areas maybe Monday and Tuesday of the survey, and then come back Friday just to get this outer band. And the other thing I wanted to touch on in terms of the plants is just something I mentioned a little earlier. Lots of different species, and this is a good thing. I believe, Hillary, maybe update, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're at 40 species, give or take, maybe 41, 42 different species, which is a great plant diversity. And the reason why plant diversity matters is because plant diversity indicates that there's a lot of different types of habitats in the lake, and also the lake is conducive to a whole bunch of different plant growth, which actually is pretty important. For example, down here is a plant called Robbins pondweed, and Robbins pondweed is an indicator of good water quality. Some of these other species we actually don't see in polluted lakes. So this one right here is it's Area colon, which is, and I'm blanking on the common name, and I can't believe it, but that is a species that that we find in oligotrophic nutrient poor lakes. Also, lobelia is another species we find usually in relatively pristine lakes. So these are all good signs. And in the plan we are gonna talk more. We're gonna kind of expand on some of the more abundant plants that we've seen, and some of the other things with the native species. So initial survey takeaways. Obviously, we haven't entered all the data yet, so we don't have really specific information on the particular distributions of plants and variable leaf, but there's sort of some things we can kind of look at. The first thing that kind of struck us when we were out there was, a lake like Raquette that has this large multiple basins really leads to some patchy aquatic plant distribution. And I think it's really evident when you look at a place like Boulder Bay versus a place like the Marion River. When we went out to survey Boulder Bay, there was a lot of littoral zone out there, a lot of areas that are 10 feet and under. I can't remember, Hillary, it maybe took us, going pretty slow, maybe took us maybe 15 minutes to get from the back of Boulder Bay out to the main lake again. And that was all because we were traveling slow in water that was anywhere from that 5 feet to 10 foot range. However, there was almost no aquatic plants outside of these emergence over here. So that could tell us some things about where other plants can establish versus a place like the Marion River, which is relatively, let's say, protected from the wind. There's more organic material in that particular river, so that could lead to a different aquatic plant assemblage. And in the middle of Boulder Bay, we found no variable leaf milfoil, and anecdotally, where we were seeing the variable leaf milfoil was in some of these protected coves. So once again, just a preliminary observation, but it could lead to some potential inferences and potential prioritization of management. For example, would you want to spend a lot of time, in the future, managing an area like Boulder Bay, or even surveying an area like Boulder Bay, when maybe those resources are better used in an area where variable can grow more frequently and has the potential to expand? Once again, these are things we're still working out. Sporadic inflated bladderwort distribution. This was another plant that we really wanted to look at. However, during our survey, we really didn't find one or two areas where it was really, really, really abundant. It was sort of patchy, so this is something that we want to look into a little bit further. Also, the large infestations in the Marion River and South Inlet. I touched on that a little bit earlier in terms of why we think that may happen. But once again, this goes back to finding out, right, which strategy do we think is going to work best there? Also, what are the goals for these particular rivers? Because, and we'll talk about that in a second, but the goals really dictate how you want to approach the management here. If you want to really, really eradicate from the Marion River, that's going to require a completely different strategy than controlling the variable leaf milfoil, allowing navigation passage, and so on. So those are the sort of things you need to consider. And also, once again, great species diversity. So just moving into the last part of the presentation here, I'm just going to touch on some of the things you can expect in the management plan. There's going to be more stuff included as well, but this is just sort of, once again, an overview of what what we look to provide your group at the end of this. And the first thing right off the bat is sort of this goal-based management. It's very important in any sort of management strategy to define your goals and threshold for management action. A lot of lakes are very aimless and goalless when it comes to management. They see a problem and they just want to try and get rid of it. And unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. Goals really need to be a balance between achievability and noticeable benefit. You can't set yourself a goal that you're not going to be able to achieve. As Gail said, you're not going to be able, it's very, very, very unlikely you're going to be able to eradicate variable leaf milfoil from the lake. So it makes no sense to set that as a goal. However, you want to have a goal that actually has some noticeable benefits. So, maybe, just removing milfoil from one little, or managing milfoil in one little cove, it may not be ambitious enough in terms of showing a beneficial impact. If you only remove 20% of the variable leaf milfoil, that may not lead to an increase in natives, that may not lead to a difference in recreation. So there needs to sort of be a balance between these two strategies. And also these are based on the lake uses. And lake uses are one of the most important things when it comes to lake management and the planning. People use lakes for different reasons. People love to fish, people love to swim, people love to boat. And sometimes these uses are in conflict. For example, fishermen like aquatic plants. And they especially like aquatic plants that have nice thick coverage and have nice weed lines for people to fish. However, that same condition for aquatic plants that fishermen really like may not be something that boaters and swimmers like as well. So kind of managing those goals and expectations are very, very important. And when you establish the goals, you also have to establish the management areas and sort of decide which areas are the most critical for the control. Do we prioritize management at boat launches, at marinas, large camps, key navigation areas that we something for like the Marion and the South Inlet? Also, if there's an early infestation that we see in the lake, is that something we want to sort of get on top of really quickly, not let it get out of control? Those are all things to be considered. And the other thing, one of the other things we're going to do in terms of the aquatic plants is look at some of the management strategies for plants in particular. In a lot of our plans, we like to give very detailed discussion of the management techniques in terms of looking at how things in the past have worked. So we know that that Raquette has tried a bunch of suction harvesting. We've also tried benthic barriers. So understanding what worked, what didn't work with those particular techniques is going to be very instructive for recommending things in the future. Also, we're going to talk about some other techniques that may have not been used on Raquette in the past. These include potential herbicide treatments and some other stuff. Herbicides is something we can expand on more in the plan. The one thing I will mention about that is that the Adirondack Park in the past has not had a lot of aquatic herbicide use. However, we did get the first pilot, I said not we, but the first pilot treatment of a very safe aquatic herbicide called Procelicor has been used in Minerva Lake, which is in Essex County, I believe. So we're kind of looking at that pretty closely because in other lakes, Procelicor has been very, very, very effective at controlling milfoil species. So once again, this is something we're keeping an eye on. We don't know if this is something we would actually suggest for Raquette, but it is something just to kind of, it's something to at least think about in the future. Once again, depending on the goals and depending on how things shake out. We also give examples of successful and unsuccessful applications of both suction harvesting, herbicides, and other techniques to sort of learn from where others have made mistakes from. Pros and cons, relevant to Raquette, not relevant to other lakes, but relevant to what we think Raquette lakes can handle. Also, we like to give guidance on the planning and implementation. So how do you select a contractor to do suction harvesting? What do we think they need to do? What sort of performance criteria should they meet? Do they need to be harvesting at a certain amount per day? What sort of reporting do they need to be done that needs to be done? All those sort of little logistical things that are sometimes overlooked when it comes to planning these techniques. We'll also talk about outreach and funding. There is some potential funding sources that we can expand on further in the plan. Raquette is lucky that it's actually located, and this arrow is not where it's supposed to be, but it's supposed to be right over here. Raquette is located within the Great Lakes Basin, so that could potentially open up some funding. Also, there's other funding for the Water Quality Improvement Program, Invasive Species Grant Program, which is where you got your funding from initially. There's other avenues of funding within that program. And also education and outreach. You know, none of this management works unless the community is engaged in this. Once again, you know, I said it before, but it doesn't really do much if you bring a consultant in, they don't talk to anybody, they just send in the plan and then that's it. You know, outreach from the community, support from the community is really the only way these lakes get done, because, you know, when we're only on the lakes for 5 days a year, but you guys are there every day, you're using it. So it's very important to keep people engaged in the process, and more engaged people can lead to, you know, benefits in terms of both financial and both volunteer support. So increased, you know, educational seminars, continuing communication from the association to the group is all stuff that's going to be, you know, expanded on in the plan. And I would be remiss to mentioning, I know Gail mentioned it in the beginning, but take the survey. You know, this is the way for you guys to let us know what you think of the lake, how you use the lake, and especially, you know, your uses and the way you feel about how the lake has changed is going to directly shape the management plan and directly kind of influence the way the Preservation Foundation works on the lake in the future. So if you haven't done that, please go take a look at that. So once again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. I apologize if we may have sped through some things, but please send any questions you have to us, and we will try to get to some questions now. And then if we don't get to those questions now, we can answer them in sort of an email format later on.
So currently there are no questions in the chat box. So if someone has a question relevant to something here, or a question about the plan or anything that's going to happen in the future, you can click on the chat icon here, and up will pop a little place where you can type in your question. If at the end there's no people that type in questions, I'm going to allow everybody to unmute themselves and we can answer questions out loud. So I'm just going to wait a minute. And thank you, everybody. Okay, so I've allowed participants to unmute themselves. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. So I just had one question come in. It doesn't say the person, but so it said the road salt issue wasn't addressed. So not everything that's been talked about tonight, the lake management plan is going to be much more comprehensive. Tonight's presentation was generally to introduce ourselves, talk about what we have done so far, and then all of the information will be synthesized into a lake management plan for you guys. And that includes chloride and conductivity data that does have to do with road salts and use of road salts in the watershed.
Hillary, I would just like to thank you and AJ for a really wonderful and very comprehensive presentation. It was much more comprehensive than I even expected that it would be. And I want to thank everyone who hung in there for this entire meeting. It really means a lot to us in the organization, and we look forward to the next meeting. I just wanted to thank everyone again for coming and say goodnight, and let you know that my husband came over during the presentation and my house did lose internet, so I need to thank Lenny Shantz for letting me sit on his screen porch to continue the program. Thank you very much to everyone, and good night.
Yep, there was a couple other questions that came through. I just typed an answer. Someone had asked that the Hamilton County data was used, and yes, that was all part of the data analysis that was done. And another comment saying that Golden Beach had an algae bloom this summer. I would encourage.
No.
It was E. coli.
Oh,
E. coli.
Okay. So, but that doesn't change my answer. So if you see something, talk to either Len or Gail, because taking pictures, and you guys are on the water more than we are. So if you see something that seems off or something different, please take a photo, send it to Gail. She will send it to us if she's unable to answer your questions. And then our shore surveys were used. So the volunteer data is definitely part of the lake management plan. It wasn't part of our survey that was done so far, but it will be used, and volunteers are going to be critical moving forward.
Yeah, and something I glossed over when I was talking about the aquatic plants is that we have all the past data that was used for collecting aquatic plants in a similar way that Hillary was using the other data. So that we're going to have a very in-depth discussion about what was happening before and what's happening currently. So yes, the shoreline data is all going to be included in the plan.
Yep. And the Doppler system it's not a Doppler system, it's a sonar system. You can actually see growth of plants on the sonar device. And so that was really, really key to looking in deep water areas where, like the Eldon Lake area that AJ showed, we didn't have points set there because it wasn't part of the original APIP survey area. But we've gotten very good at driving over and knowing when there is potentially a plant that looks like milfoil. And then any plans to do tests on the Fulton chain of lakes? I'm not aware of what's going on over there, but we would love to work with more lake groups like yourself. So thank you, everybody. I know this was a long presentation, but I hope that everyone learned something. Have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Never before has something so comprehensive been shared with the public. That was great.
I'm trying to get us to leave.
Okay, I'm signing off so it will end for everybody. So I really appreciate your attendance tonight. Have a good night.
Thank you, Hillary.